So I'm a little bit daunted this morning to talk about evangelisation and St John Paul II for a couple of reasons. He was Pope for 27 years, third longest papacy in history. Millions of words written and spoken on the public record. So as I said, I'm kind of a little bit daunted, but I want to talk about John Paul II and the golden thread of evangelisation. And I'll just do two things. I want to point out some of the features of the vast landscape of evangelisation that he painted through his teaching. That's the first thing. And the second thing I want to consider just one way we might respond to that. There's all kinds of valid ways to respond to this huge canvas of evangelisation that he painted, but I just want to sort of later on focus on one. So if I had to pick a golden thread that runs through the teaching of the popes on evangelisation over the last 60 years, it's this. Evangelisation consists of proclamation and application. So I just want to quickly break open some of that because most of us will be familiar with it. First of all, proclamation. Luke Chapter 9, verse 2, the apostles preaching and teaching and their successors, those authorised by them, teaching and preaching officially and publicly about the words and deeds of Jesus. The next one is 1 Peter 3:15, explaining the reason for hope in the context of suffering. This is essentially us being able to talk to people and tell them what the Christian meaning is of human suffering in light of the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. It might possibly go into testimony, but it's really about what does the church understand the Christian meaning of human suffering to be. And the next one is Luke 8:38 to 39. Witnessing to what the Lord has done for you personally. That text is about the Gadarene demoniac. You might remember Jesus came across a man. Guy said, "There are many demons in me." Jesus cast them out. And he said, "Return to your home and declare how much the Lord has done for you." If you were missed being at the gathering at Yass, where Kate Kirk broke open this aspect wonderfully, grab hold of the video link and have a look at it. It's really good. So, application. By that I simply mean applying the faith and church teaching to all parts of your life and mine. This is essentially witness of life. And this is really important. Pope Paul VI, in his letter on evangelisation in the modern world, said, above all else, the gospel must be proclaimed by the witness of our life. So the two things go together. And in fact, when he talked about this witness of life, he actually referred to this wordless witness of our life, which should stir up questions in the hearts of non-believers. Questions like, why do these Christians live like this? Why are they in our midst? So our very lives should evoke those questions. The separation of proclamation from application was a profound concern for Pope Paul VI and John Paul II. It continues to be a profound concern for Pope Francis. If you read his encyclical letter, the first one he put out when he became Pope, The Joy of the Gospel, he deals with this in a really thorough way and at quite some length. John Paul II said this: "There cannot be two parallel lives. On the one hand, the so-called spiritual life with its demands and its values. On the other hand, the so-called secular life, that is, life in a family, at work, in social relationships, in public culture and public life." So he's sort of saying there's a tendency in the world, and this, both, as I said, all the popes have kind of spoken about this, to separate faith from the rest of life. And that's due in part to cultural pressures. Our personal witness for Jesus will shine more brightly to the extent that our interior and exterior life is united in Christ. In light of this, I want to recall here this morning the words that John Paul II spoke at the beginning of his service as Pope. "Be not afraid. Be not afraid." You and I can take some comfort in those biblical words of reassurance. But when those words first came out of his mouth on the 22nd of October 1978, members of the church, you and I, were not the intended primary audience. In the words of Acts chapter 2, verse 39, the message was for those who were far away. We know that because the very next thing he says is, "Open wide the doors to Christ. Open wide nation states, economic systems, and fields of human culture." And brothers and sisters, many of those in the East and the West who held the keys to those doors were far from the gospel. 11 years after John Paul II spoke those words in St. Peter's Square, the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe we saw collapsing before our very eyes. What many thought would finish in a revolution of blood finished in a revolution of love. A revolution of conscience fueled that love, and it was lit in the hearts and minds of people by John Paul II, who fanned the flame of the Holy Spirit into an inferno, but an inferno of love. Do you know, many years after the Soviet Empire collapsed, John Paul II was asked the question, "Well, Your Holiness, what was your role in the collapse of the Soviet Empire?" And he simply said this: "The tree was rotten. I gave it a good shake." But he didn't shake that tree alone. His witness for Christ gave courage to others to come and shake parts of the tree that he couldn't shake. Pope Paul VI told us that evangelisation is not just about preaching the gospel to ever-wide geographical areas, but it's also about upsetting, by the power of the gospel, humanity's criteria for judging good and bad, judging sources of inspiration and lines of thought, deciding social values and models of life contrary to the gospel and salvation. Pope Paul VI said it, and the papacy of John Paul II was a masterclass for the entire church on how to do that, especially as far as lay people are concerned. As laity, we're especially tempted to separate faith from living it in all parts of our life. And it's a temptation for this reason, because the world will accept us if we don't affect the culture. Happy enough to have Christians in our midst, provide a little bit of glue to hold things together, but just don't upset the culture at all. John Paul II was profoundly convicted about this, and he said this is pretty strong language: a faith that doesn't affect culture is a faith not fully embraced, not fully thought out, not faithfully lived. He's not essentially focused on results with that statement. He's not oblivious to results, but he knows that results are God's business. He is very much focused on people giving witness in the world. What might happen when faith doesn't affect culture much? That's a question that we can kind of think about. Well, one thing that can happen has happened. In many countries, the church has withdrawn from child adoption services because civil law doesn't permit the church to choose a married couple as parents. As recently as 2 weeks ago, the Archbishop of Sydney said this, quote, "The church will be forced to consider closing Catholic schools if the government strips them of the ability to hire teachers who are supportive of Christian teaching." Some of you may or may not be aware that the government is currently considering changes to the law which have been in place for about 40 odd years that enables Catholic schools to hire people who, if they're not sympathetic to the faith, at least are not going to sort of, publicly go against it. Archbishop Fisher said closing Catholic schools would be a last resort. But nobody sitting here today should think that the closure of the Catholic education system in this country, in the form that we currently know it, is an unthinkable thought, because the Archbishop of Sydney just thought it. Getting back to John Paul II, he identified in 1988, I think this list actually grows more relevant as time has marched on, 5 priority areas for the evangelisation of culture. And they're up there. I'm not going to sort of read them out. Why did he put a focus on this? Because these are the areas in which, in a sense, human culture is born, renewed, regenerated and transmitted from generation to generation. And he saw, as I said, I think with the passage of time, we can see the wisdom of him putting a focus on this list. He said these are areas that really we need to put some priority into evangelising. And again, just a few other mission fields for evangelisation. Most of the John Paul II stuff, I should say, I think it's on the slides, I've taken from his apostolic exhortation on the vocation and mission of the laity. Okay, so a great pope with an enormous vision for evangelisation. I haven't even really scratched the surface of it this morning, but I've just pointed out just a few features of this landscape that he's painted. But I want to turn now to the question of what's one way that we might be able to respond to this. And I want to suggest to you that the story of the road to Emmaus gives us a clue. So we're just outside the Easter period not long ago, and we heard this story at Mass, and so I'm not going to read the whole of the story, but just pick out a couple of verses which I think are relevant. So, two disciples are walking along the road towards Emmaus, and Jesus joins them, and he joins in the conversation and asks a question: what are they talking about? And in the midst of it, they say, "We had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." And they were walking along and they were pretty sad. It says that in another verse in Scripture. They were sad. So their hope was crushed, leading to a feeling of being downhearted and dejected. Anybody here who's had their hope crushed knows what that feels like. But I want to suggest to you that there's more than an emotional feeling of just being a bit downhearted going on here. I'm not dismissive of emotions in the spiritual life, as many of you know, but there's a bit more than emotions going on here. They'd heard reports of the resurrection and they were utterly astonished, dumbfounded, speechless. Couldn't believe it, really. They said this, verse 24, "Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said." So the women from their group had gone and they'd come back and they'd reported that they found it just as they'd said, but they did not see him. They did not see him. Therefore, we're not going to believe. That's what's going on here. We get the report, he's alive, we choose not to believe it. And so they leave Jerusalem despite being told about what the Father had promised, to stay in the city of destiny and promise. No, we're going. And so they start walking away. They're going in the wrong direction. They're walking away from Jerusalem, going in the wrong direction, and Jesus joins them. And Jesus joins them. Going in the wrong direction. Walks with them for quite some time. Pretty well close to the end of the day. What might it look like to walk with somebody who's going in the wrong direction or far away from the gospel? I think I'm doing okay for time, am I, Tim? Yeah, fine. Okay. So, two little stories. So the first one, this one was told by noted Catholic evangelist Sherry Waddell, and it concerns two guys, Thomas and Greg. And Thomas and Greg have worked together for 30 years, so a long period of time. Gareth was a lifelong atheist, aggressive scientific atheist, and he regularly heaped scorn on Thomas's religious beliefs. But one day, Gareth's wife died, and he turned up on Thomas's doorstep wanting to talk about God. Make no mistake, grief did not make Gareth any easier to deal with, and it didn't make him softer. He'd borrow books from Thomas, read them, come back, chuck them down on the kitchen table, declare them to be rubbish, have a big argument, and leave with 3 more books. And this went on for some very considerable period of time. Gareth changed very slowly. After several years, he said he believed in God, but as far as organised religion was concerned, like Catholicism, forget it. He joined the RCIA program and later on and pulled out after one session. Quite some time later, he went to the RCIA a second time and pulled out a second time. Sherry Waddell told this story to a conference of catechists, and she said, I wonder how you would feel having Gareth in your RCIA program. Yeah, that was about the response that the conference gave. The look on their faces, she said it all. Nobody wanted a Gareth in their RCIA program. One of the things that this story shows us is that you might be walking with somebody for some very considerable time and not see results, because results are God's business. I want to tell you another story, a slightly different story. So quite some years ago, I was approached by a man, and I didn't really know him at all. I had sort of seen him around, I think, a couple of church events. I knew his name because I'd met him at a church event, but I didn't really know anything about him. Anyway, I can't even now remember exactly when we sort of really connected, but he approached me and we had a very brief conversation. And then and the result of that was we agreed to meet for a much longer conversation over coffee. I'm a cheap talker at $4.50 for a cup of coffee. So we sat down and he did a lot of the talking. And at one point he said, actually there were 2 points in the conversation where he said very clearly, very strongly, he said, my life, I'm slowly, very slowly, but very surely walking away from God. Very slowly, very surely walking away from God. I was a bit surprised. He then, towards the end of the conversation, I think we might have had more than one, sort of said, well, will you walk with me? I didn't kind of really appreciate at the time, but I was getting an invitation to walk with somebody who said they were going in the wrong direction. And I said yes, only after having had the thought, I think this is going to be a lot of hard work. And it was 5 years before I saw Jesus move definitively with power, embrace this man and say, and the Lord say to him, I want to be really close to you. And that man was able to reciprocate that gesture. So patience is really important in terms of evangelisation. I'm a great believer in what St. Teresa of Avila said, that with patience all things are possible. We won't evangelise culture unless we walk with those who are far away from the gospel or going in the wrong direction. And we might need to get a bit creative, but not coercive, with the opportunities for evangelisation if we want to walk with those who are far away or going in the wrong direction. I want to leave it there at this point, and I'm going to invite you to break up, I think, into groups of about 3 or 4 if you've got an uneven number. And we've got this discussion question. What opportunities exist for you to walk with somebody who seems like they're either far away or going in the wrong direction. They might be far away from God, but you know, those two stories that I just told, they were people who were actually, in one sense, very close. Very close. So, 5 minutes on that question in groups of 3 or 4.